The major dropped the mission brief on the table and looked around the room like he was already done with the question before he asked it. Who put Hollenbeck on the primary slot? Nobody answered right away. That was always how it went when Hollenbeck was in the room. Staff Sergeant Diane Hollenbeck had been in the Canadian Army long enough to know that silence. She had learned to read it the way a meteorologist reads a pressure system, not by what it said out loud, but by the direction it was moving. The silence in that briefing room in Camp Mirage was moving in one direction, toward her. She didn't look up from the map spread across the table. Major Caulfield was a man who had come up through the infantry in an era when the idea of a woman on a direct action team was still something people argued about at mess dinners. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't need to be. He had a way of assigning tasks that made his opinions clear without him ever having to state them. Administrative work that kept her in the rear, patrol briefs where her name showed up on logistic instead of execution, recommendations that somehow never quite made it to the right desk. He was good at paperwork. She had to give him that. There's been a change, he said. Hollenbeck, you're on comms coordination for the duration. Sergeant Tibble takes the primary. She looked up then, not in defiance. She had learned a long time ago that defiance in that room cost more than it bought. She looked up the way she looked at a range target, steady, patient, taking stock. With respect, sir, she said, Tibble qualified at 800 meters on his last range day. The mission profile puts us at a position where the engagement distance could exceed 1,200. Caulfield didn't look at her when he answered. He was already turning to the next slide. We'll adjust the approach corridor. She nodded. She folded her hands behind her back. She said nothing else. Warrant Officer Decker caught her in the hallway after. He was one of those men who operated like a ship's anchor, not the kind that drags, but the kind that holds. He had been watching the dynamics of that team for 8 months, and he understood them the way a quiet man who pays attention always does. You're not going to say anything, he asked. I already said something, she told him. You said the minimum. I said what would be heard. He walked beside her for a moment without speaking. They passed the board with the unit photo on it. Taken 6 months before, everyone in kit, desert backdrop, the kind of photo that looks identical to every other unit photo until you're in it, and then it looks like a record of a time that already feels distant. Range scores for the upcoming exercise are due next week, Decker said carefully. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. I heard, she said. Hollenbeck had grown up near Petawawa, in a house where the sound of weapons fire from the base ranges was as ordinary as rain. Her father had served 22 years in the artillery. Her mother had been a nurse at the Civic Hospital in Ottawa and had a practical view of most things, including the fact that her daughter spent her school lunches reading wind tables and asking questions about ballistics that no one in her grade 8 class understood. She had enlisted at 20 after 2 years at Carleton studying physics, not because the physics hadn't interested her. It had, but she had found, sitting in lecture halls while her classmates complained about midterms, that what interested her more than the theory was the application of it, the way a body moves through space, the way variables interact at the moment of decision. The way precision is not a talent, it is a practice, a discipline, something built over time through repetition and honesty about failure. She had qualified as a sharpshooter in her first year. She had gone through advanced training and come out at the top of her cohort. Her instructors had written assessments that used words like exceptional and uncommon without embarrassment. She had filed those assessments away the way other people filed tax returns, knowing they were important, not expecting them to change her daily life. They hadn't. She had arrived at her current posting 6 years into her career and found Caulfield running the unit the way he had run every unit before, competently in the broad sense and selectively in the specific. He had 4 women on his roster. He treated them all the same way, as administrative assets in operational packaging. She had watched the other 3 adapt to this over time, each in their own way. Corporal Levens had gotten louder, more aggressive in briefings, until Caulfield simply stopped calling on her. Private Andrick had gotten quieter and then had put in for a transfer. Sergeant Nowak had developed a kind of studied cheerfulness that Hollenbeck recognized as armor. The kind you build when you've decided that the territory isn't worth the fight, but you're not ready to leave it either. Hollenbeck had done something different. She had gotten quieter in the meetings and more precise at the range. She had kept records, not to report them, just to know them. In the locked drawer of her locker, she had a notebook. Not a military issue one, but a plain green one she had bought at a pharmacy in Ottawa the year before her deployment, and in it she had written down her qualification scores, her shot logs, her environmental data, her adjustments, her patterns of error and correction. She had tracked herself the way a scientist tracks an experiment, without sentiment, without narrative, with only the numbers and what they meant. The numbers were very clear. At 1,600 meters, in variable wind, in low light with a heart rate above resting, her accuracy was within a margin that most qualified snipers could not reach at 1,200 in ideal conditions. She knew this. Nobody else needed to know it. The notebook stayed in the drawer until the range exercise. The exercise was a joint task force evaluation, the kind that involved observers from Ottawa, assessment forms that went into personnel files, and a scoring matrix that was supposed to be objective. Caulfield had built the team roster himself. Tibble was on primary. Hollenbeck was on observation and call. The morning of the first exercise day, she went to the range 3 hours before anyone else arrived. The sun was just coming up over the desert, and the air had that quality it has before the heat builds. Clear and still and honest, the way air feels before the world wakes up and starts complicating itself. She set up her position at the elevated platform, confirmed her zero, and spent 45 minutes making adjustments she had calculated the night before based on the forecast conditions. Then she waited. Tibble arrived with the rest of the team at 0600. He was a capable shooter. She had watched him train and she did not underestimate him. He was good. He was just not the right tool for the distances the evaluation would require. And she had known that since she had read the evaluation parameters 3 weeks earlier. The first stage went to 800 meters. Tibble shot clean. The evaluators nodded. Caulfield looked satisfied. The second stage went to 1,100 meters. Tibble put 4 of 5 rounds in the scoring zone. The fifth landed 14 centimeters wide. The evaluators noted it. Caulfield said nothing, but she saw the way his jaw moved. The third stage was the problem. It was listed on the evaluation sheet as a distance variable engagement, which meant the distance would be called live, no preset zero. It was designed to test adaptation under pressure. The distance called was 1,420 meters. Wind had come up from the southwest at about 11 knots, gusting. Temperature had climbed 6 degrees since morning. Tibble shot twice. Both rounds missed the scoring zone. The lead evaluator, a warrant officer named Fraser, from the assessment team out of Edmonton, looked at his sheet. He looked at Caulfield. "You want to call it?" Fraser asked. Caulfield said nothing for a moment. Hollenbeck was standing 12 meters back with her own rifle cased. She had been standing there for 3 hours. She had been calculating the current conditions continuously, adjusting the numbers in her head the way some people do long division, quietly, automatically, without effort, because it was simply how her mind worked in that context. She said very quietly, "I have a solution." Caulfield looked at her. Fraser looked at her. "Staff Sergeant Hollenbeck," she said, "if you want a qualified attempt on the stage." Caulfield's expression was the particular expression of a man deciding how much a moment is going to cost him. Fraser said, "Let her shoot." She did not rush the setup. This was something she had learned early and had to relearn several times before it became reflex. That speed and preparation is almost always borrowed from accuracy, and the debt comes due at the moment it can least be afforded. She took 4 minutes to establish her position, confirm her data, and account for the current wind reading versus the forecast divergence. Fraser was watching her the way evaluators watch, when something unexpected has entered the frame, and they're trying to decide what category to put it in. She breathed. She brought her heart rate down. There was a specific mental state that long-range shooting requires, and she had spent years learning to access it on demand, a kind of deliberate narrowing of attention that excluded everything except the variables in front of her. Wind, distance, elevation, the angle of the light, the temperature of the barrel, the weight of the trigger. At 1,420 meters in 11-knot crosswind with gusts, the margin for error is approximately the width of a human palm. She put the first round 3 centimeters left of center. The second was 2 centimeters right of center. The third was central. Fraser wrote something on his sheet. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She uncased the rifle and began to break down her position. Behind her, she could hear the unit processing what had just happened in the way that military units process unexpected information. First with silence, then with half sentences, then with the noise of people deciding what they actually think. Tibble, to his credit, said, "Good shooting, Staff Sergeant." She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." Caulfield said nothing at all. The evaluation report landed on the squadron commander's desk 11 days later. Lieutenant Colonel Warwick read it in the way that senior officers read documents that are going to require them to make decisions they hadn't planned on making. Slowly, more than once, with the expression of someone who is confirming that the thing says what they think it says. It said what he thought it said. He called Caulfield in first. She wasn't in the room for that meeting. She didn't need to be. She had learned long ago that some conversations happen whether you're present or not, and the ones that happen without you are sometimes the ones that matter most. What she knew was that Warwick had a reputation as a man who read data the way she read wind, practically, without attachment to what he'd expected it to say. 2 days after that meeting, Warwick called her in directly. She sat across from him in his office, which was the kind of military office that has exactly as much personality as the occupant chooses to bring to it. Warwick had a photo of his family on the corner of the desk and a whiteboard with logistics notes and nothing else that told you much about him. He said, "I read the evaluation." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I also pulled your service record, your training scores, your range history." She said nothing. "Why?" He said, "Is none of this in your current posting assessment?" It was a genuine question. She had learned to distinguish those from the rhetorical ones. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the assessments reflected Major Caulfield's operational priorities." Warwick looked at her for a moment. "That's a very precise way of saying something," he said. "I'm a precise person, sir." He almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "Effective immediately," he said. "Your operational role is being reassigned. I'm putting you on primary qualification for the advanced marksman slot on the unit. Caulfield will adjust." She held her posture. She kept her expression neutral. She said, "Thank you, sir." She walked out of his office, down the corridor, and out through the side door onto the gravel pad between buildings where the desert light was flat and white and honest. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel the thing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, because feeling it too early had always seemed like a way to lose it. Not triumph. Something quieter than that, something more like recognition, the sense that the numbers had finally been read by someone willing to read them. 3 weeks later, the call came in at 0347, not an exercise, not a training scenario. A reconnaissance element had gone dark in a sector 22 kilometers from the forward operating base. 8 personnel, last contact 40 minutes prior. Signals intelligence suggested they had been located by a hostile surveillance network that had been operating in the area for 6 weeks. The same network that had evaded 3 previous interdiction attempts because their command element kept moving, kept adapting, kept staying just far enough out of reach. The element was cornered in a compound on elevated terrain. There was one viable approach for an extraction team. There was also, on the opposite ridgeline, a position from which the command element of the surveillance network had established observation. Warwick looked at the terrain map for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Hollenbeck. "Tell me what you need," he said. She went over the data with Decker and a signals analyst named Price for 40 minutes. The position on the ridgeline was 1,680 meters from the only viable shot angle. Wind from the valley below would be channeled and variable. The hour before dawn would mean low thermal variance, but also reduced ambient light. She asked for the most recent meteorological data from the monitoring station 12 kilometers east. Price pulled it in 6 minutes. She did the math. She wrote the numbers down in the green notebook and looked at them the way she had been looking at numbers like those for 6 years. "I can take the shot," she said. Decker said, "What's your confidence level?" "High," she said. "Not certain." "High? Difference?" "Certain means I could do it twice without adjusting. High means I do it right the first time." Decker looked at Warwick. Warwick said, "Move." The insertion was fast and quiet. She moved with a 2-person support element, Corporal Fahey and Sergeant Dade, both of whom she had worked with enough to trust, and neither of whom asked unnecessary questions in the field. They reached the designated position 41 minutes after departure. The ridgeline was cold. At that elevation in that hour, the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees, and the wind off the high terrain had a quality that she associated less with weather than with intent, the kind of cold that isn't interested in whether you're comfortable. She set up the position in darkness using feel and practice memory, and said nothing while Fahey established comms and Dade watched the approach. At 0524, she had the position. The target was not stationary. The command element had established themselves in a natural rock depression. that provided cover from three directions. They were professional, and they were patient, and they understood concealment. But they had, as professional adversaries sometimes do, made one small systematic error. Each time one of the senior personnel exposed themselves to observe the route to the cornered reconnaissance element, they used the same angle from the same corner of the rock depression, within a window that lasted approximately 4 to 6 seconds. She had been watching the pattern for 19 minutes when she was certain of it. She settled her breathing. She ran through the numbers one final time. Not because she didn't trust them, but because checking is not the same as doubting. It is what precision looks like from the inside. The crosswind shifted. She adjusted 3 clicks left. She waited. The pattern held. The window opened at 0531. She took the shot. At 1,680 meters, in variable crosswind, the round traveled for approximately 2.1 seconds before impact. In those 2.1 seconds, she was completely still. Fahey came over comms 4 seconds later. Extraction team is moving. She stayed in position and watched. The extraction team moved clean without interdiction. 8 personnel extracted, 0 casualties. She began breaking down the position without being told. Decker's voice came through when they were halfway back to the fob. "They're all out," she said. "Copy." She didn't say anything else. The paperwork for the commendation took longer than the mission. It always does. That is one of the realities of military service that the recruiting materials tend not to emphasize. That the documentation of what happened often takes more time than the event itself, and is often handled by people who were not there and are working from other people's accounts of what the numbers mean. The recommendation went up through Warwick's desk and continued upward. There were questions. There was a review. There was a secondary assessment of the shot data by a ballistics analyst at CFB Gagetown who looked at the environmental conditions and the confirmed impact data and wrote in his report that the probability of a first-round hit under those conditions at that distance was statistically in the upper 5th percentile of recorded operational engagements. She didn't see that report until later. She was on another assignment by then. What she received, 6 weeks after the mission, was a phone call from Warwick telling her that the commendation had been approved. The ceremony would be at the base in 2 weeks. She would be recognized in front of the unit. She said, "Yes, sir, thank you." He paused before hanging up. It was the kind of pause that means something. "For what it's worth," he said, the evaluation report from Frazier had already been flagged before this. The range data alone was enough to change the conversation. She said, "I know, sir." "You knew?" "I knew the data was correct," she said. "I trusted the data." Another pause. "See you in 2 weeks, Staff Sergeant." "Yes, sir." The ceremony was on a Thursday. Warwick read the citation in front of the assembled unit. She stood at attention and listened to her own name in the same place where, 8 months earlier, her name had been quietly removed from an operational slot by a man who had not seen fit to explain why. Many of the same people were in the room. Some of them had been on the range that day with Frazier. Some of them had been on the extraction team. Some of them were simply part of the unit, which meant they had been present for all of it, the before and the after and the distance between. Caulfield was there. She did not look at him, not from anger. She had thought about this moment enough times in the preceding weeks to know what she wanted it to be, and what she wanted it to be had nothing to do with him. Warwick pinned the commendation to her chest. He shook her hand. He said something quiet that wasn't part of the official remarks, the kind of thing that senior officers say in those moments when the ceremony stops being a ceremony and becomes something more like an acknowledgement between people who understand what something cost. She said, "Thank you, sir." Afterward, in the corridor, Decker fell into step beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered this for a moment. It was not a question she had been asked often in her career, and she had learned to be careful with it, not because the feeling wasn't there, but because feelings in that context were better examined than performed. Like the numbers were always right, she said. Just waiting for someone to read them. Decker nodded. That was enough of an answer for him. She walked out into the afternoon. The light was doing what desert light does at that hour, cutting low and sharp, making shadows long, making the distance between things look greater than it is. She stood for a moment and let herself feel the weight of what she was carrying, which was not the commendation, though she would keep it. It was the 6 years of quiet, the notebook, the mornings on the range before anyone else arrived, the small daily decision to be right about the numbers even when no one else was going to check them. That was the weight. And it was not heavy. It was just the cost of knowing what you know and continuing to know it until someone with the authority to act on it finally looks at the same evidence you've been looking at all along. She walked back to the accommodation block. She had a range session scheduled for 0500 the next morning because she was the kind of person who schedules range sessions the day after commendation ceremonies, not out of compulsion, but out of the simple understanding that the practice is the thing. The recognition is a moment. The practice is what was there before it and what will be there after. In her locker, the green notebook was where it had always been. She didn't open it that night. She didn't need to. She already knew what the numbers said.